Joining me now is senior writer for the National Review, David French, my friend op-ed columnist for the New York Times and MSNBC political contributor, Bret Stephens, and vice chair for the New York State Democratic Party and former New York City Council Speaker, Christine Quinn. David, to you first, because I found this piece quite interesting. The New York Times published a piece that's drawing attention to the optics of having the summit specifically in Vietnam, and I want to share a piece of that. As Vietnamese officials play host to the summit meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un of North Korea this week, they're offering up the hope that North Koreans could somehow mirror Vietnam's trajectory, transforming from a closed society strangled by central planners to a bustling nation full of capitalist enterprises. I mean, that is a stunning picture. But is it real? Is it persuasive in any way? There is no real indication that denuclearization is in store for North Korea.
You know, I look at the optics differently. I look at the Vietnam location as a location of a nation that drove America out of Southeast Asia. I look at it as a nation that sees itself as defeating a superpower. So I see it in a little bit different light than that picture painted by the New York Times. I mean, look, let's just be very real about this. The only reason why the North Korean leader has had now 2 audiences with the President of the United States is because North Korea is a nuclear power. The only reason why North Korea, all the eyes of the world are on North Korea right now is because North Korea is a nuclear power. The nuclear identity, the identity of the North Korean state is wrapped up in its nuclear ambitions. The idea that they will give that up when they are finally achieving what they've wanted for a very long time, I think is just sheer fantasy.
What do you think, Bret? I mean, David brings up a great point. Nuclear power is the reason we care.
Right.
Sandy beaches ain't it.
Listen, David's analysis is spot on, and another difference is that Vietnam is a historic enemy of China, whereas North Korea has always been a client of China. You know, it's very important to try to put yourself almost empathetically in the mind of a dictator. What are dictators good at? How is it that they're able to stay in power? They stay in power by being able to spot weakness, by being able to spot what your adversary clearly desires and then dangling it before the adversary and being able to withdraw it. Kim Jong-un understands that Donald Trump is desperate for a foreign policy success. He's desperate for a Nobel Peace Prize. He's desperate to be able to say, I'm the man who finally ended the Korean War that only stopped with an armistice in 1953. And so he understands who he is dealing with. The master negotiator in Vietnam today now is not Donald Trump and the art of the deal. It's Kim Jong-un and the art of the steal and the cheat. This is behavior he's replicated. His father, his grandfather did the same thing, offering concessions, then reneging on them and starting a crisis and doing the same thing over again. And Donald Trump is falling for precisely the same con. And
there is Donald Trump in a blue tie, descending from Air Force One. He'll be stepping onto that red carpet in just a moment. You mentioned how important this is and the power position that Kim Jong-un is in. I want to bring in NBC's chief global correspondent, Bill Neely, who is also in Hanoi. What has Kim Jong-un been up to today? I mean, it's 9 p.m. there. He's had a full schedule.
Yeah, so Kim Jong-un is here. He's already been actually out on the streets. He went to visit the North Korean embassy. North Korea, of course, interestingly, just like the U.S., has an ambassador here. It's one of the many reasons why Hanoi was chosen for this summit. He left his hotel. He was accompanied by those 12 jogging bodyguards that we saw for the first time in Singapore. And, of course, he arrived here earlier after arguably the longest journey by any leader to any summit in about half a century. It took him 2.5 days to get here, 2,500 miles across China by bulletproof train. But he is here now for, well, we don't know. Is it going to be history in Hanoi? It's not as historic a summit as that first meeting in Singapore, but arguably it may be more consequential because the first summit, of course, was as much about symbol as the summit itself. The meaning, if you like, was in the meeting in Singapore, but it ended with that vague declaration that they should work towards denuclearization. They didn't define what denuclearization meant, and since then, nothing has happened. There's been no sign that North Korea is disarming. In fact, U.S. officials point to increased production of nuclear fuel, still working on ICBMs, long-range missiles that potentially could reach the United States. So Kim, on the surface, looks to have done absolutely nothing to disarm. Indeed, U.S. officials say they don't know whether he's even taken the decision or not to disarm. We have no inventory of his nuclear arsenal. There's no timetable, no roadmap. So that is the hard work that this summit is meant to begin to do, to try to implement some of those vague promises from Singapore. So look, the pressure really is on. It's simply not enough to do the grip and grin, the handshake and the smiles and the flowery words. That may be good enough for the letters they seem to exchange between one another. But now the world needs to see some action. And, you know, this is, I mean, we've got used to the idea that it's not a nuclear crisis anymore. But remember what's been happening on the other side of the world. India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed nations, are confronting each other over the unsolved problem of Kashmir. You know, just under the surface of the world's events is a potential nuclear crisis. And of course, just 15 months ago, we were potentially looking at nuclear conflict between the US and North Korea. So it may not be as historic a summit as Singapore, but it's certainly consequential. The stakes remain high here.
But then is there an argument to be made or a question? What's the point? If the first summit was a grin and grip and an agreement or a tacit agreement between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, and then the work was to be done, it doesn't seem like any work was done. And if U.S. officials, and I do not mean President Trump, if U.S. officials are indicating that North Korea hasn't done anything, what exactly are they going to talk about in this second summit? I ask you, Christine.
Well, that reality that nothing really has happened really goes to what you were saying. It puts Kim Jong-un in the driver's seat here. And if you look at much of the coverage leading up to today, the president's aides are very nervous that the president's going to act too quickly, that he's going to get into the room and just give all kinds of concessions to come out with some symbolic win. So what's the point? The point is to give Donald Trump another press opportunity to try to salvage a foreign policy win here, when really all he got out of the first one was something he attempted to manipulate and spin into an important international event when it really wasn't. It was almost embarrassing to the United States.
Every time Donald Trump meets with a dictator, speaks with a dictator, he agrees with him. Think of the Helsinki summit. Think of how he decided to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria against the advice of all of his advisors following a phone call with the Turkish strongman Erdogan. So I think the risk here is very real, that Trump is going to ignore the advice of his advisors, of the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, who, by the way, are longtime hawks when it comes to North Korea, to warning about the dangers of negotiating with them, and strike a deal that he won't be able to walk away from and doesn't want to walk away from anyway, because his goal isn't the national self-interest. His goal is re-election.
Right. But, David, look at President Trump, who he is as a businessman historically. He's willing to walk away from everything. So are we misunderstanding this, and that we could look at the first summit and say, look, he got nothing done. It was a photo op. But that's not the case. He's 1 inch, even if it's an inch, closer to that Nobel Peace Prize nomination, and Japan is happy to help him out. He might not be a foreign policy expert or someone who's able to get anything positive done on the foreign policy front, but he's quite the salesman. And does this show help him on at least the national stage?
Well, I do think the show helps him on the national stage. I think it helps him with his base. I mean, to this day, I live in Trump country in Tennessee, and to this day, I constantly encounter people who will tell me one of his many accomplishments is he has neutralized the North Korean threat. He has saved us from war. Now, this is not true. He has not neutralized the North Korean threat. War wasn't imminent to begin with, but there has been a sales job that has been done. I mean, I think the way to look at Trump, you know, The Art of the Deal was a book that helped make him famous, but he's really and truly a branding expert. He's really and truly a salesman, and so he's able to sell these events to the base.
And a lot of voters buy it. If you a lot of voters who aren't looking under the hood are buying into it. They see the president having not one but 2 meetings, and they hear what he has to say, and they believe it.
Well, and they believe it because the other thing that he sells is that he sells that the alternative here was going to be some sort of fictional imminent war that he was allegedly warned about by President Obama. So he's sold that there's this that the only choice is what he's doing or a horrific and terrible war. So a grateful nation turns its eyes to him and is thankful that he's saved us from war, at least the part of the nation that believes what he's saying about this. And you know, the funny thing is, this kind of echoes a little bit of the language Obama used to sell the Iran deal. It's war or the Iran deal. Now it's war or whatever Trump is doing here in North Korea. And it would surprise me a great deal if he came out with a deal with North Korea that was the kind of verifiable deal that we could actually count on to achieve disarmament.
All right, quickly before we move on, Peter, where's the president headed next?
The president is going to his hotel for the evening, and then tomorrow he'll have his first series of meetings, including with the president, the prime minister here, as well as with Kim Jong-un tomorrow evening. But, you know, as you speak to David there, you can't also overstate the side-by-side viewing that Americans will have over the course of these next 24 hours. Literally within moments of Air Force One touching down here in Hanoi, Michael Cohen, the president's longtime formal attorney, I know you'll talk about this plenty, just arrived on Capitol Hill, not answering questions. So for those who are skeptical about the timing of this meeting, it's one more item to point to. The president obviously will be counter-programming this conversation about whatever Michael Cohen chooses to say regarding his long period of time working for President Trump. He's expected, according to sources familiar with the testimony that will take place over the course of a 3-day marathon, talk about what he witnessed the president do, including comments that he viewed as racist, things that he identified as potentially criminal. It's going to be a dramatic series of days, and it's one of the reasons why some of the president's critics are concerned that he may be willing to, quote in their words, give away the store to try to redirect the conversation to what takes place over here in Vietnam.
My goodness, there will be a lot for us to look at. And there you have it now on your screen. Just think about this. We just went 1 second ago from the president in Vietnam, and there is Michael Cohen, his former lawyer and fixer for a decade. Michael Cohen. You can see his attorney, Lanny Davis, right next to him. And why is he there? He's on the Hill for his first of 3 days of testimony. Here's what we have learned about what he's going to say. He wants to talk about President Trump, the man, the businessman, even what he did after he was elected president. We're going to dig into that after the break. As I said, I'm glad I'm back from jury duty. We got a lot to cover. David, what's your take on all of this? You know, Sarah Sanders has some pretty tough words. You know, Michael Cohen speaking is garbage and no one should care. But I don't know. I speak to people in the White House. They seem to be sweating this a little.
Well, I think they're sweating it for good reason, because what we've seen in the legal proceedings is the prosecutors have been relying on more than just Michael Cohen's words. The prosecutors have been moving forward on the basis of a lot of corroborating evidence. And the question here is, if I'm in the White House, if all I'm confronting is Michael Cohen's word, that's a problem, but it's a problem you can deal with. Right. But if what I end up confronting is a mixture of Michael Cohen's word and a lot of corroborating evidence, then that becomes a bigger problem. And one of the ways you'll be able to tell if it's a bigger problem is if some of the messaging begins to shift away from pounding on Michael Cohen into this is a needless distraction from the super important work that the president is doing in Korea. There's going to be a shifting messaging strategy here, I think, depending on how all this goes. And if Cohen is credible and he has corroborating evidence, then he's going to be a distraction. If Cohen is telling a lot of stories where no one else was in the room or the other people in the room didn't create any documentary evidence backing him up, well, then it's going to be Cohen's a liar, Cohen's a discredited felon.
We also, though, as viewers, as the media, have the ability to pay attention to more than one thing. Doug, let's add a third thing, Paul Manafort. Sure. So his lawyers are now arguing for leniency in his sentencing, saying this. This case is not about murder, drug cartels, organized crime, the Madoff Ponzi scheme, or the collapse of Enron. So Their argument is he's not the worstest human on planet Earth in the universe. I mean, come on now.
They say necessity is the mother of invention. Wrong. Criminal defense is the mother of invention. That's a very...
I mean, are his lawyers now going to be arguing
very
for
hard
lenient
argument.
sentences for drug offenses for young boys? Come on.
Extremely hard argument to make, obviously. But, you know, you play the hand you dealt with. Sorry for all the cliches, you know, card playing, football. But joking aside, that's what it is. I mean, they're in a tough box. The guy is really, really in a tough legal spot, obviously.
That he created for himself. I mean, you know, there's nothing to feel sorry. Nobody feels sorry for Paul Manafort right now because
Paul Manafort does.
Paul Manafort does.
Yes.
Apparently, even his family doesn't necessarily feel sorry for him because there have been a lot of negative reports coming out about who he is as a person lately. But I think the important connection here, if we bring it back to Michael Cohen and to testimony that we shouldn't ignore, is that there are a lot of ongoing investigations related to all of the issues we're discussing, and prosecutors and investigators do not want those investigations to be interfered with. And part of what that means is they're telling folks what they don't want talked about because it could compromise the investigations. Now remember, Trump Organization is under investigation right now. In fact,
you know Don Jr. doesn't think it should be.
I do know Don Jr. And if I was Don Jr., I wouldn't want it investigated either. Right. So the issue is, if you have a Michael Cohen, you have ongoing issues about whether there are going to be additional charges against Paul Manafort. You do not want any of those investigations to be exposed publicly because people can start to figure out how to game your investigation, and you don't want that.
Wow. All right, Shannon, before we go, take me to your newsroom. There is a lot to focus on. What's the most important thing? What are you most concerned of today?
Well, I mean, I think today is going to, you know, the president will be asleep in Vietnam. And I think now it's getting ready for this Michael Cohen testimony and what comes next. And I mean, still remember, we have the Mueller report out there. The Justice Department told us that won't be coming out this week, but it still could come out very soon. And I think expectations that we have, or at least I have, for Cohen tomorrow is that, you know, we might not see him implicate the president in any new crimes. We're not going to find out anything about Russia because the House Oversight Committee is not, you know, that's not their task. But the concern for the president and from his allies and advisors is that Michael Cohen will embarrass him. And you see he's mentioned things about racial language, about inflating his wealth, you know, to pay less on taxes. Those sort of embarrassing things that maybe aren't a crime, because if there is something that's a crime, as Maya was saying, it'll probably be kept with prosecutors and not discussed publicly, but that this is going to be an embarrassing event. And of course, overshadow what the president wants to be this Nobel Prize winning moment with this summit with Kim Jong-un, and not only to mention the president's own personal desires for what he could get out of this summit, but that summit that has huge national security implications because the North Korean president is, you know, North Korean leader is a nuclear power. So you have that in jeopardy too. And I think it is very possible that the president is going to be spending a lot of his time watching and thinking about Michael Cohen coverage when he should be thinking about this summit with Kim Jong-un. I know his advisors will try and make sure that doesn't happen and distract him as much as possible with meetings and briefings on this summit, but Michael Cohen's certainly going to be on the president's mind.
There is a lot going on, and guess what? There's even more happening on the Hill today. Democrats are going to be challenging President Trump's executive power. This afternoon, the House will vote on a measure to terminate. Did you hear what I said? Terminate, finish, finito, the president's emergency declaration in an effort to halt his plans to build a wall along the southern border. The resolution is expected to pass, leaving its future to the Senate. But guess what's happening? Republican Senator, I'm going to say that again, Republican Senator Tom Tillis, who's got to run again in a year, wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post that he would vote against the emergency declaration, while other members of his party, Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, have indicated they may also vote with the Democrats. And up next, this week, the House is going to be voting on 2 gun control measures. While they should pass in the House, their fate in the Senate is up for debate. Saying up for debate is optimistic. With Capitol Hill completely jammed, big business is stepping up. Think about this. Business is stepping up on social issues when the government isn't. I'm going to be speaking to a sporting goods CEO who's completely changed how his company has sold guns after the Parkland shooting. But is his decision causing a big financial backlash? My question is, where are the customers supporting this move? David, let's switch gears for a moment. Elizabeth Warren spoke to my colleague Chris Hayes last night, and she said she's going to forego big donations because she simply thinks there's too much money in Washington. She makes a compelling argument, but is it one that's going to do her in? Having a lot of money helps you win.
I don't think it'll do her. I don't think she's going to have trouble raising money. No Democrat is going to have trouble raising money. This is going to be there will be an extraordinary amount of money spent in this election. Any Democrat who emerges from the primary is going to have an avalanche of small dollar donors. These are the kinds of things that are not real sacrifices, in large part because there's so many other people and outside groups using their freedom of speech to argue issues, in some circumstances to argue for candidates. So this is one of those sacrifices that is not going to mean much in the real world. It's something that plays well for a very small slice of voters who really rank high on their list of concerns, the amount of money in politics. But let's keep all this in perspective. The amount of money in politics is still far, far less than the amount of money we spend on lots of different kinds of random consumer goods, and yet politics helps shape the direction of the world's only superpower. So I'm not entirely convinced that there is too much money in politics.
Really?
Really. When you consider that Americans will spend probably more money on their pets, for example, than they'll spend on trying to work through and wrestle through some of the most important ideas shaping the destiny of our nation in an atmosphere of unbelievable civic ignorance in this country. How do you get a message out to people who don't follow politics?
Hold on a second. Do you think campaign dollars actually make us smarter on the civics front? If that kind of money was actually going to, I don't know, civics education in public schools, I might buy that argument.
Well, one of the things that dollars do is they allow people to have access to voters. They allow people to have access to voters to share a message. You know, those of us who pay close attention to politics, get sick of the avalanche of ads. We are completely overburdened with information. The average voter is not.
And those ads, I look forward to ads that are going to make us smarter and better, but I'm an optimist. Let's see what we get in 2020. David, Brett, Christine, pretty eventful hour. Thank you.